Steve Rosenthal was sound asleep when all of a sudden he heard a loud noise and he felt that his unit was shaking. He didn't know what was happening, but when dust started falling on his face, he saw and he looked out the window and he knew something was happening. Is this an earthquake? He thought to himself. Rosenthal made his way to the front door of his apartment and saw that his hallway had been blocked by debris. All I saw was cement, wood, and I heard people yelling, "Help me, help me," Rosenthal said. As he waited for that help, he prayed that the rest of the building wouldn't collapse. Alfredo Lopez and his wife, Marian, were asleep when they first heard the thundering blast that jolted them awake. Moments later, there was a second boom, much louder than the first, that shook the bed on their sixth floor of their Miami apartment. Alfredo rushed to wake up his 24-year-old son, Michael, urging him to get dressed before running to the balcony window. Just then, the lights cut out and the emergency alarm came on, warning the residents of the Champlain Towers to evacuate. When Alfredo opened the front door, half of the building was gone. A jagged 5-foot chunk of floor barely allowed them enough room to escape. There was no hallway, no ceiling, no apartments, no walls, no nothing, he said. The 61-year-old froze in terror, unable to move. I was petrified. I really thought, this is it, we're going to die. These are just some of the dozens of stories that came out of the tragic collapse of the Champlain Towers in Surfside, Florida this past June. At a time when we were just coming out of our COVID cocoons, where we had been sheltering individually, along came this disaster that struck entire families, that devastated an entire community. Gone in an instant were parents and children, siblings, married couples, grandparents, and grandchildren. There was the Velasquez family in Unit 304, which included Angela, who owned a men's boutique, and her husband, Julio. On the same floor down the hall, Unit 311, were the Patels, Vishal and his wife, Bhavna, and their 1-year-old, Ashani. Unit 701 and 702 was Nancy Levine and her 2 sons, Jay and Frankie's new wife, Anna. On this day of Yom Kippur, I call to mind these stories of Surfside. I have to tell you that seeing the building collapse, I immediately thought about the attack on the Twin Towers, whose 20th anniversary we just marked. To be sure, 9/11 was far larger in scale, but Surfside was tragic in its own way because while 9/11 was an intentional foreign attack, Surfside was a homegrown, self-inflicted disaster. If 9/11 was plagued in part by naivete, Surfside was the result of negligence. And that is not just devastating, it is damning. Of course, amidst the grief and the anguish, there were some uplifting stories. We were encouraged watching first responders search for weeks and weeks without giving up hope. We took pride in Israeli search units that quickly arrived to lend a hand, using the very technology they employed to detect underground terror tunnels coming out of Gaza. The Israeli team searched for survivors and victims in Surfside. But these heartwarming stories do not hide the heartbreak. We can leave it to structural engineers to determine exactly how the building collapsed, but today we ask why. Why did it collapse? It was not just because of cracks in the building's foundation, but because of cracks in the community's foundation. It collapsed not just because concrete pillars didn't have enough rebar, but because relationships were not reinforced. Essential values were already beginning to crumble. And because pillars of the community shirked their responsibility, choosing the allure of short-term savings over long-term planning. With a lack of trust in one another, and utter dysfunction on their board, they were unable to make critical decisions and timely repairs. Again, I'll leave it to journalists to follow the story, but I raise the topic today because I believe that what is true of a building in Florida is true across our land. And I'm not talking about the infrastructure bill. For too long, we have failed to take the necessary steps to fix the brokenness of our world, to address climate change, poverty, gun violence, systemic racism and inequality, political stagnation, and on and on. The same could be said of our personal lives on this Yom Kippur. Who hasn't caused some damage with a harsh word, broken promise, a hardened heart? There are repairs that we need to make with our spouse, with our parents, with our siblings and children and friends and our colleagues. Now, the truth is, stories from this past year about disaster and despair abound, too numerous to count. But I dafka turn to this story of Surfside because in this case, the message is just so clear and simple and urgent. Don't delay fixing what's broken. Don't ignore that which needs repair because failure to act can be deadly, literally. When we look out on our world, we can easily be overwhelmed by what is broken. We find encouragement, though, in the words of Reb Nachman of Bratslav, who taught that if you believe that you can break, believe you can repair. Im atam ma'amim shecholim lekalkel ta'amim shecholim litaken. We have the ingenuity, we have the insight and the ability, we have the resources to repair, if only we have the will and the drive. The call for tikkun is not only about social justice initiatives kind of out there. It begins with each one of us, our individual decisions and actions right here in our own homes, our communities, our offices, our cities. It begins with how we treat our family and friends, how we care and support our neighbors, how we treat our employees and strengthen our community, how we live lightly on this planet. It begins with each of us dedicating time and energy and resources and talent to this work of tikkun. Because each of us has something to give, and it is desperately needed because things are crumbling around us. And that's where this verse comes in that Cancer Tister and I chanted at the beginning of these remarks. Im Hashem lo yivne bayit, shav amlu bom novo, im Hashem lo yishmor ir, shav shakad shomer. If God does not build the house, the builders build in vain. Im Hashem lo yivne bayit, shav amlu bonavo. And if God does not guard the city, the guards guard in vain. The Im Hashem lo yishmor ir, shakad shomer bo. This is a verse about building a house. Actually, I often quote it when I officiate at a mezuzah hanging at a home dedication ceremony. But it wasn't until this year that I really understood its deeper message. If God does not build the house, the builders build in vain. That is to say, when it comes to building, we don't just need Bob the builder, we need God the builder. And I'm not talking about an old man with a beard and a hard hat. Rather, when we build buildings, communities, relationships, we must do so on a strong foundation of godly, of sacred values, responsibility, dependability, trust, respect, loyalty, honesty, and on and on. Absent those things, collapse. But there's something more in this verse. We read in the Talmud's volume on Yom Kippur about the ritual of the Kohen Gadol. On the morning of Yom Kippur, the Kohen Gadol was charged with officiating at the daily offerings. Now, they had to be offered at exactly the break of dawn, and in an era before smartwatches, a group of his assistants were assigned to make sure that the Kohen Gadol was awake on time. They developed all kinds of strategies, it says in the Talmud. They snapped his finger loudly in his ear. They made him stand on cold marble and do calisthenics to wake him up. And while they didn't play the harp or sound the shofar, they did sing. And what did they sing? Im Hashem lo yivnei bayit shav amlu bonavo. If God does not build the house, the builders build in vain. Now, at first glance, it seems like an odd choice of a verse. I can imagine King Solomon saying these words when he dedicated that temple. And indeed, these words are from the only psalm attributed to King Solomon. But why is it that this is the verse that the assistants used to arouse the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur? I could understand if they sang, Modeh ani lefanecha, it's time to get up, or wake me up before you go. But why do they sing, if God does not build the house, then the builders build in vain? With these words, the assistant reminded the Kohen, before the most important service of the entire year, to direct his heart to God. His ritual had to be set on a firm foundation of faith. Absent that, the whole edifice and the whole ceremony would be in vain. All of the work of those who labored to build that very building would have been for naught. And all of the efforts of past generations who had served with pride and honor would have been futile if under his very watch, the Jewish people's relationship with God began to crack. Today, thousands of years after temple times, the verse remains for us what it was for the Kohen, a wake-up call. It reminds us that the high holidays call on us to repair our relationships and repair our world. And the need could not be more urgent. If we do not rebuild our community, our country on a solid foundation, they will be beyond repair and crumble. So where do we find that repair manual? I suggest that we return to the basics. Yisodei HaTorah, Rambam's chapter called The Foundation of Torah. In it, he lays out the essential elements of Jewish belief. Those of you who have studied some Musar might recognize this first teaching, for it is here that Maimonides concisely states Judaism's basic contention, saying, when the Jewish people grew from a family to a nation, God saw that they needed teaching and law, proper guidance and character development for the sake of the success of society. Thus, God gave Torah. Ra'ah Hashem, ki tzrichim hayu letorot ulemishpatim, lelimud v'hadracha yeshara, im letikun hamidot v'hatzlachat ha'chevre, al ken natan lehem haTorah. Rambam goes on to outline essential elements necessary for the prosperity of a nation. Long before FDR's CCC, Rambam said a society must be built on 4 C's: compassion, consequences, covenant, and commandment. First, he says there must be compassion. We are, as we've said over and over again, to be like God, El Rachum V'Chanu, one who is compassionate, who is concerned about others. Such a person looks beyond themselves to those in need. Now that part we know, but this next part that Rambam says might be surprising. He writes, when a compassionate person sees 2 people unknown to him, he is equally compassionate to both of them. He will not do good to one which will result in the other's harm, but will aspire to the equality of their lot. In other words, for Rambam, out of compassion flows righteousness and equality. Next, he says schar v'onish are needed. Rambam calls on us to recognize that our actions have real consequences. Yes, repairs can be costly and time-consuming, disruptive and difficult. But what happens if we fail to act? We must consider our choices carefully, anticipate the outcomes, and act accordingly, not just for our own benefit in the short run, but for the good of all in the long run. Finally, he says, covenant which is tied to commandment. Covenant is a fancy way of saying a community of purpose. And the commandments give us that very purpose. We've been given a job as Jews. We've been charged with a mission as a people. In Rambam's words, the mitzvot are, quote, for the improvement of character and the prospering of the nation and the good of all people. Kol hamitzvot v'achukim asher natan Hashem la'amo hamikaven behem tikun hamidot v'atzlachat ha'umah v'tova ansheha. The 4 C's. Grow in compassion by pursuing justice and righteousness. Carefully consider the long-term consequences of your decisions and act with prudence to minimize harm and to grow blessings. Deepen your involvement in community, for we are stronger together. Fix not only what you broke, but what you see that needs fixing. And finally, grow in mitzvot, in commandments, that you and our nation might prosper. Im Hashem lo yivnei bayit. The verse was meant to keep the Kohen Gadol awake and ready to begin his divine service. For us, as we enter 5782, the shofar's blast and the lesson of Surfside awakens us to a new year with the same urgent message. Get to work on the repairs that you've postponed. Build a house, establish a life on Yesodei HaTorah, on the laws and values of Jewish tradition. Then will our buildings and our community stand firm. Then will our home and our hearts be a fitting place for God to dwell. Im Hashem lo yivnei bayit shalom lo navo. Im Hashem lo yishmor ir shavshokat shomer. Im Hashem lo yivnei bayit shalom lo navo. Im Hashem lo yishmor ir shavshokat shomer. Hine lo yanum velo yishan lo